There we are. Hello everybody. Let's get everybody on screen here while we get started. And let me get all my windows going here. Okay guys, let's say hello.
Hello.
Hey Chris. Sorry, hey Steve. There's
Yeah.
Chris. So let's see, lower right we have Steve Turner from Australia, from Melbourne. Lower left we have Chris Meyer of Learning Modular in New Mexico, not too far from where I'm at now. Upper left we have Cody Murray, who's also in Albuquerque. And today we're going to, of course, be talking about the vector sequencer. And apologies for a little bit of a late start. And looks like we already got a few people on the chat line. And so today we're going to be talking about gates and triggers on the vector sequencer and the expander. And looking at the setup over here, we have lots of triggers out. We have run, clock, and reset, which can be used for sync, gates, or triggers. And they can both be inputs and outputs. I'm just going to be talking about outputs today. And then for the two pitch gate velocity sets on board the vector, of course there are two gate outs, 4 more gates on the jack expander, and then 8 triggers on the jack expander. And the gates are generally only allowed to be assigned to parts, but the triggers can be assigned as part outputs, or basically as sort of mini clocks, or a few other tricks, also as inputs, and Chris will be talking a bit about that later. So I'm going to start with basically a blank project, and let me describe the patch a little bit. So
Hey,
part
do
one.
you want to pin your vision?
Yeah.
That old chestnut.
Spotlight for everybody. There we go.
There we go.
One day
Thanks,
I will
mate.
not forget that.
That's all right. That's why the value I provide. Just that
It
one thing.
is. It is.
You,
So part 1, pitch 1 is winding around here and goes to a AGH mini mod oscillator, and the gate, it winds around into the first input on the quadra, which is a 4-channel envelope generator. But also I like to use 2 envelopes with this part. I want to have the second one on the filter cutoff, and instead of using a Y cable, because I like right angle cables and I've yet to find a Y cable with right angle connectors, I'm actually running the second envelope on the quadra from trigger number 5 on the expander, and that winds around, triggers the second one, and then comes back out and winds around to the CV input on the SEM filter. And as it is now, there are no gates in part 1, but envelope 2 is triggering on its own. So I want to see what's going on with this output and reassign it so that it matches the gate outputs on part 1. So to do that, I go to the routing page, press the global button, press the next button twice. So all of the stuff in globals is grouped into 3 main pages: general for general settings, parts for part-based settings, and the routing pages. We're going to be working on the routing pages today. So using encoder 9, I'm going to scroll down through some of the subpages. You can see these are the output assignments for the pitched parts. So pitch 1, gate 1, velocity 1 are all part 1. Pitch 2, gate 2, velocity 2 are all part 2. Scroll down to run, clock, and reset, which are these outputs here. And then one more to get to the trigger outputs on the expander. And all 8 of them are here, and I think that's coming through relatively clear. You can see that they're assigned to a variety of basically clock divisions. So 32nd notes, 16th notes, 8th notes, 8th notes again. Trigger 5 is on quarter notes, and the sequencer is running, so that's what's making this guy blink. I can change it, of course, by dialing in. We'll go dial up to 16th notes up here, and you can see when I change the value stays gray, and there's a little Q indicator there, and that means to push the encoder to activate the change. And if you look up on the right hand side of the screen, let me shorten this envelope, you can see that's now blinking a lot faster. I can slow it down, say half notes. Right? So this is a handy way to generate clocks or regular events for anything else in the modular. In fact, I usually assign the clock output. I'll go ahead and do that now. Right now it's at 16ths. I'm going to set that to be quarter notes. That's actually going to a magneto, which is off screen, which wants to have quarter notes for delay synchronization. So back here on the trigger output settings, for trigger 5, I want to assign it so that it outputs the same thing as gate 1. So we've talked about, you know, all these clock divisions. If you keep scrolling through, you start getting to some ones that don't look like standard musical divisions. There's ST1, GT1, RS1, and what these stand for are step 1, for meaning step for part 1, gate for part 1, and reset for part 1. So I'm going to set it to be, I'm going to start with step for part 1. And now the output is stepping, even though I haven't programmed anything into part 1. I can turn on some gates. Turn the filter up so we can actually hear it. Now you can see that envelope 2 is moving independently of envelope 1, because envelope 1 is only being triggered when there are actually notes on a step. Envelope 2 is always being triggered. And this can actually be an interesting little trick. Let's say I'm on step 1, so it's at the same rate as part 1. If I go back, say 16th note triplets, I'm diverging a little bit, but this was a neat little trick I started playing with right before the demo. So I can set this to be completely independent of the part, apply it to the part. That can be useful sometimes. Or I can dial this up. Step 1. Now it's always in time with the part. I can also set it to GT1, which is gate for part 1. And now the two envelopes always trigger at the same time. So basically I've duplicated this output gate here with this trigger here. And I do this also for part 2, which I have patched but I'm not going to use today. Gate 2 goes to envelope 3 on the quadra, and trigger 6 goes to envelope 4. So to program that, I would go to trigger 6, and then there's a little shortcut to know about 2. If you hold down the shift key when you're turning the trigger knob, it will jump to kind of standard locations. So at the fastest end, well, there's off. S48 is very fast, that's intended for sync. 16th notes, then it will jump all the way to 32 whole notes, which is the slowest trigger. And then to ST1, which that range we're using over here, ST1, GT1. We'll get to RS in a minute, that's reset. Hold down shift, jumps ahead to RS8, which is reset on part 8. One more, and it goes to D5.1. This is for drum assignments. I'll get back to that in a minute. And then D8.4, again a drum assignment. And the last one is EXT, which just makes it in input mode. And Chris will be talking about that in a little bit. So let me hold down the shift key and go back to ST1. I actually want to assign it to be the same as the gate on part 2. So I release the shift key and dial through to GT2, press the encoder to cue that up, and if I quickly jump to part 2, turn on some gates there, you now see I have the other two envelopes blinking. Don't have the part sounding, but the envelopes are blinking. Okay, so back to our trigger assignment page. So I've assigned 2 triggers to mimic out parts. I also, on this project, have part 8 set up for drums. So I'm going to show how to assign one of the outputs to trigger drums. And back on the routing page, I'm going to use trigger 8. No, I'm going to use trigger 4, which is right now generating eighth notes. It's going into the qubit surface, and if I start the sequence, you can see that's blinking. I can bring that up. That's just basically a snare sound. And it's running off of trigger 4, eighth notes. Of course, as before, I can start playing with the rate here, but I want to assign it to a drum, so I'm going to hold down the shift key and dial through until I get to D 8.4. So the D is for drums, 8 is the part number, and then the number after the dot is the voice or lane within the part. And 8.4 is the last lane of the last part. I want to bring this back to D8.1, which will be the first lane of part 8. Press the Q button. So now no automatic snare. We navigate to part 8. So now I can dial in a snare pattern. I also have hats up here on the crucible, and that trigger is coming from trigger 3. Go back to the routing page. Trigger 3. Is on eighth notes by default. Again, hold down the shift key, dial all the way to the end, 8.4, then come back to 8.2 in this case for the second lane. Now jump back to part 8. So now I have the hats on, sorry, the cymbal on lane 2 in the drum part. Another trick you can do, of course, is I could assign the hats to go to mimic part 1 as well. Back to the routing page. And again, I would just set it to be GT1, or if it's part 2, GT2. We'll go with GT1. Dial back manually. Get to GT2. I'm sorry, GT1. And now the hats follow part 1. Or again, one more time, go back here, I could put it on RS1. This is for reset. So the reset happens whenever the sequence gets back to the first step. So now the hat only triggers on the downbeat. And of course, you could also use that reset to trigger another sequencer, reset some other sequencer. You could actually even take the trigger and map it in as an input on the vector to have one part reset another part. So you can get into some interesting combinations. But to summarize, basically the trigger outputs on the expander are super flexible. You can use them as clock generators, simple pattern generators, or you can have them mimic outputs from other parts, or generate clocks based on the rate of a part, or reset signals from that part. And that just about wraps up my part of the demo. The guys have any questions for me?
So just obviously there's an obvious thing there. The Q function's there so that if you were doing something live, you could switch your times around without it affecting your live performance until you press the encoder. Obviously that's a nice function if you're changing and you want to make sure you select the right division without messing things up. I think it's fair to say, Jim.
Yes, that's the whole idea behind the Q. And just another area where that would be super useful is on the sequence control page, where it would be nice to be able to make some alternations in terms of length or rate, and have those ready, and then cue them, and even be able to quantize that to the next beat or next bar. And
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask for. Is it do the same thing as the preset changes, be able to cue it to a quantized setting?
Yeah. You know, the cue on the triggers is new with 2.0, and so it's kind of just getting used to that functionality and figuring out how to expand it appropriately. And
excellent. Great. And obviously, when you're doing it direct from the jack expander, you're not having to deal with sort of MIDI connections to other devices. And I know a lot of people do that too, and I do it in one of my cases as well. Just means you're getting that really tight connectivity and timing from just using CV and gate outputs and so on, I guess. Yeah, nice one.
Yep. Oh, and I guess one last thing to show, since I've been talking about drum assignments, is, you know, looking at the expander in terms of how you're going to assign different triggers to different instruments. You know, pitch and gate, if you're not needing velocity for a part, you could say, I've got trigger 4 going to the surface. I could assign velocity 4, which is here, to be part 8, and it says V1 for voice 1, which is the voice for this, but it also, if it was, say, part 3, go to part 8, but hold down the shift key so I can change the voice number, and now this is voice 2. So now these two velocity outputs, I could patch in the fourth one in the surface and the third one into the crucible, and then looking at part 8, these levels will translate into CVs because the triggers are only on and off. If you want the CV value, use the velocity output. So you can, you know, just thinking about grouping, the top 2 rows can be for pitched parts, and then the middle 2 rows can be for drums with CV, and then the bottom 4 could be to clock other things, or for drums where you don't need velocity control or any type of CV control.
So Jim, also with some of the trigger outputs you're doing on the jack expander, if, for instance, like on your main vector panel, I don't see the run or the reset patched, could those be allocated as trigger outputs?
I have to check, but that is the case. So yeah, you can use, if you're not using these for something else, you can use them for trigger outs on a part, which is pretty handy.
Yeah, for the folks that don't have the expander, that just need a couple of extra triggers, that's a handy option. I've certainly used them that way before. It's nice.
Yeah. And then these can also be inputs, and Chris will be walking through this, but reset can be an input that you can use to reset a sequence. The trigger outs can be inputs that can be used to step things. And I know Chris has requested to add the stepping capability to these inputs so that they're a little more general purpose. So that's something that I know he's looking forward to in his travel case.
That would be very cool. I'd love that for my small case too.
Okay, so let's let me flip the camera around and stop bouncing the other camera and get our gallery going here. Okay, so, and later on in the session we'll be taking questions from the chat line, so be sure to chime in. And now it's special guest time. Our next guest needs no introduction, but is going to get one. Chris Meyer, who is a good friend and lives nearby, which is very lucky for us. And he is one of the co-authors of Patch and Tweak. Let me get that right. Which I have around the studio and consider to be essential reference for modular synthesis. Also, he runs the Learning Modular website, and let me cue up this image here. And Chris, tell us a little bit about the Patreon option at.
Yeah, I've done a few different ways to try to share what I've learned over the past few decades. And in addition to doing videos on YouTube, and I have several set online courses that are very structured, just every day and every week I'm learning new stuff with modular synthesis. So I'm using my Patreon channel as a way of just sharing the incidental things that I discover, or the bits of history to dive down, various rabbit holes. Why was this designed this way, and why does this work this way, and how can you use it now? So I've been using my courses as, here's the set course you can follow. But if you want to just, get the brain dump of what I'm working on, what I'm thinking of, and where some of those crazy thoughts came from, and also just so I can do some long form writing rather than the short form that things like Facebook and Instagram want. That's what my dedicated Patreon channel is for. And I've got a few hundred patrons on there. It's just been fantastic in supporting me. And that's been a really great way to communicate more directly with some hardcore people.
Excellent. I think it's great. And then also, you've been, I know, writing music off and on for many years. And the Alias Zone project, you have a new album of material that you prepared in conjunction with the live event coming up, but I'll let you tell us a little bit about the Alias Zone project.
Yeah, I've been playing music, jamming on and off with people for a few decades now, and I actually set that aside for a while when I got into the video and film industry. And then back about 2015 is when I decided to get back into modular synthesis. And I spent a few years just trying to figure out where the limits were with the modular system in the way that I like to work. Previously, I used loops, and I was a Ableton Live jockey since version 1.0. But I spent a few years just focusing, what all can I do with the modular? And then sharing that by creating some courses on it. But now I want to get back into doing more music. And I've been really focusing on the modular as the core of what I do, but I've been augmenting it with other things. Live keyboards, primitive hand percussion, folding Ableton Live back into the mix now, and starting to record pieces and do performances. The first real performance as Alias Zone again after a 20-year break was at October Skies as part of the Colorado Modular Synth Fest. And I've been recording those performances, building them together, and I'm really fortunate to have been invited by Steve Roach to be part of his very big SoundQuest Fest happening next weekend. One of the acts on Saturday. And Steve said, it's been 20 years. You really should get another album out. And been working hard to get an album of the new material together in time for SoundQuest Fest. And I have the mastered files, and it's probably going to go live on Bandcamp in the next couple days. I'm just ironing out a couple distribution questions, and it'll go live this week.
Excellent.
Well done. It's always great to get something out there after a little bit of a break, which probably 20 years qualifies as. So extremely well.
It's been a chance to explore, what am I doing now? Because I was so focused on using loops in Ableton Live back in the 90s and early 2000s. I wanted to see what was going to come out of me working with the modular. And I think I've surprised myself. I'm not doing the type of music I thought I would be doing. So that's been an interesting bit of discovery as well.
Yeah, right. I'd love to have a chat with you about that album once we've had a decent amount of time to consume it. So we'll have to schedule that.
Certainly.
Yeah, and we have a couple minutes from preview from Chris's set for SoundQuest queued up for a little bit later this afternoon. And this is going to be amazing. It's an amazing lineup, and really looking forward to seeing all the new work.
And everyone's had a chance to create videos in their studios. This has been pre-created because we didn't want to have any streaming problems. A lot of people have taken this as the opportunity to really do some nice video work as well. And there's a few dedicated video artists as well.
Yeah. No, I think this has been a great opportunity because you've got the Monster system, which isn't terribly portable. And I know you've been using a lot of equipment around the studio, so it makes it so that you can do a very carefully prepared, detailed performance without having to deal with the logistics of moving everything around. And of course, it'll be available worldwide.
Use all the tools that I have in the studio rather than just what I can put into the overhead bin on an airplane.
I agree.
I love the Alias Zone as a name because, well, what is your artist name? It's an alias. I guess that's very tricky. I love it.
It started because it was an alias for another group. I played in a group called Richard Bugg's Cosmic Debris back in the 90s. And that's a project Richard's had going since the 60s or 70s, actually. And every performance was completely improvised and recorded to multitrack. And Richard was very open about everyone's contributions. He said, if anyone wants to take any of the material and release it, go for it. It's co-owned by everybody. So I took my favorite tracks and released it as, I was going to release it as Alias. And then I found out there was a big hair Canadian metal band called Alias. I thought maybe that wasn't the best idea.
They might have pouted at you. They might have pouted at you. Or
So I started
Look at this.
researching a little bit more, like aliasing is a concept we run into in digital audio all the time. And the idea
Yeah.
is not only do you have the sound that you hear, there's a ghost of the sound existing outside your perception, hopefully, where the harmonics are inverted. And I thought, and the alias zone is the transition between those. And that just has become a theme now for this idea of a transition between reality and alternate realities in the world that I creating music.
That's lovely. I'm glad I asked you that question. Or yeah, it's fantastic.
Okay, so let's see. I know you've been doing some unusual tricks with the vector in terms of these new compositions, and
yeah, let me set up why, and then I'll show the how. I did grow up on 70s Berlin school music, Tangerine Dream, Klaus Schulze, stuff like that. So I was very much into the repetitive sequences and other trance forms of music, which includes a lot of EDM these days. But I had the chance in Cosmic Debris and Alias Zone to improvise live with other musicians, some with a jazz background. And that had a big influence on me, saying that maybe parts shouldn't just be completely repetitive. Maybe they should have variety, evolution, as if you had an attentive musician listening to the rest of what you were doing and throwing in variations every few measures. So it's been my goal to try to get the modular to behave more like an attentive member of the band rather than just a robot that does the same thing over and over again. And the first step down that path is I just fell in love with the chance operations in the vector sequencer. That's been a really important part of me to add some variety in. And I'll show some of the ways that I use chance on the vector. But now the second step is I find drummers tend to create interesting rhythms. Why can't we use those interesting rhythms for our melody lines or even to create more complex percussion lines? So I've been really working on taking the trigger inputs on the vector and bringing in either trigger generators or actual drum loops to trigger different parts at different paces in the vector to create a more interesting experience with it. So that's the patch I'm going to be actually building up from pretty close to scratch here, showing using the vector, adding some chance operations to add interest, but then adding outside triggers to really add some more variety to what I create. So with that, let me switch cameras and move over to the system. There we go. And let's wake this baby back up. Hello, good to see you again. So I'm going to give a couple different demos. One where I am triggering stuff inside the modular, but actually for this one, I'm using the MIDI output to trigger a sample library inside Ableton Live, because I really like exotic percussion in addition to synthesized sounds. So it's been fun to use the vector to drive my computer rather than use the computer to drive my modular synthesizer. So I kind of start with some simple samples and figure out how to make it more interesting. And these are things you can apply to modular synthesis as well, and I'm going to be talking about as I go. So instead of a normal drum kit, I have this sample library loaded called Ritual Gong Drum. It's a huge table-size gong that people sit around and play with their hands and with mallets and things like that. And the palm strike sounds particularly like this. Let's unmute the audio. That would always help too. There we go. So that's a pretty fun sound. And what they've done is they put a different sample on each of the white keys, so you can get different mallet strikes and rim strikes. Now what I'm doing is I'm using the pitches from the vector to change what's being triggered on the computer. But if you're triggering normal drum modules inside the rest of your synthesizer, your modular, think of the pitch output as a CV you can feed into one of the parameters on your drum modules to get variations from hit to hit. So rather than triggering different samples, you could just vary the sound in a module, or you could use the pitch output to go ahead and switch a voltage-controlled switch and decide which your trigger output from the vector went to which module. So vector out, gate, into a switch, pitch output to decide where to send that trigger, and then send it to like multiple inputs on a crucible or multiple drum modules to get the replication of triggering different samples. You could even trigger different samples on something like an assimilator. So what this particular library has is they have separate left and right hand strikes just to get a little bit of variety, and they put them 1 octave apart. So I can go ahead and lengthen out my sequence and change my gate here to trigger both sides, and shift this up 1 octave Shift key does 1 octave changes on pitches to get some variety. So that's a little bit more interesting. So that's an improvement. Fortunately, velocity is in the sample library, so you can get some different strikes depending on how hard you're hitting the notes. I can go ahead and get a harder strike on the first note and a softer one on the second.
That's nice.
And again, you can do the same thing by taking the velocity output from the vector and patching it to a parameter on your drum modules, or run your drum module through a VCA and use the velocity output to change how loud those sounds are from the drum module. So you can program that, but now it's doing the same thing over and over again. One nice thing that Jim showed me that I didn't know was in the vector was there's something hiding in the sequence control page for each part. If you press the second time, it's something called velocity variation, where it can randomize the velocity values for each note. So it just takes a little bit of variation to create some more interesting parts. And we can go crazy if we want to. So this is all getting better than just having the same sample triggered all the time. But there's another level you can go, and you can do all sorts of different chance operations. Now, in something very simple like a sample, you can go ahead and use pitch offset to go ahead and trigger different samples. What I'd like to do is just throw in random ratcheting, just have some notes doubled up. So instead of a drummer just hitting one note, then another, first note, second note, maybe do a double strike, then go back to the original note. So I might take something like the very first hit on this, set it to be a single ratchet. Here we go. Hit chance one more time and put probability. Well, we'll start pretty high so you can hear the effect and we'll back off. And what I'll typically do is I'll set it to something low, like a quarter or even less, just so it comes up every now and then, as if the drummer's sitting behind you and he gets bored every now and then. Says, this one I'm just going to do a double hit, and then just go back to the normal pattern again. But we still have this repetitive beat on the 1 and 3. So my next question is, how can I make that even more interesting? Well, I can go into the gate and grooves and start programming different patterns, different links for the notes, different pitches. But I realized I've got in my modular some really nice trigger generators. Let me go ahead and widen the camera shot here. My weapon of choice is the Mutable Instruments grids. It's a grid of 5 by 5 pre-programmed drum patterns that Emily derived from different rhythms from around the world, and the ability to interpolate in between those different patterns and to change the density in each channel. And I find this is really useful for drum patterns. Other people use Euclidean sequencers. Verona makes something like this. There's different pattern generators, Shack Mad Night Scallop. This is one I particularly like. So since I have a cool pattern generator in here, why don't I use that for my rhythm and now start to divorce the triggering of notes from the pitch values of the notes. Let the vector do the pitch values, let something external handle the triggering or when the sequence is stepped along. Let's go ahead and stop this sequence, and then dive into that global page that Jim was talking about. I'll go into my various assignments and go up to my trigger outputs, and they're normally set to nice musical divisions. And indeed, I have been starting to use the jack expander more and more to replace the panels and new work out of my system down here. Since it does a lot of divisions, and these divisions are programmable, I'm starting to use these more and more to trigger other modules inside my system. Let me go ahead and unpatch some things we're going to do a little bit later on. For example, my bit boxes, like 16th notes. I vary the clock that I send to my DLD, my delay line. I'm looking at using the jack expander more and more to drive those. And you see I'm already taking the run and the clock from the vector, putting them on molts down here to go ahead and drive at 24 pulse per quarter note grids and Pamela so that they follow the vector in my setup. And that's worked out very well. But anyway, let's go ahead and take the first trigger and let's put it all the way up here to externals and press to take that. Now that says rather than going on his own internal clock, it's going to look at what's coming in to that particular jack to go ahead and trigger and forward along this pattern. Now, Grids has 3 channels on it. Kind of, you can think of it like kick, snare, hi-hat patterns. So since I've been using this palm strike as my kick drum, I'll go ahead and take the trigger out for that particular pattern, run it to trigger input 1 on the jack expander, go back to my part for the palm strike, go to the control screen, I tend to forget this, and change the mode that says rather than using a musical division, instead, let's use that external trigger output. Whoops. Let's go the other direction here. And you might think, well, we're being externally triggered. What does rate have to do with anything? Well, that rate controls the musical division that the vector will generate internally for things like chance operations. I'm going to temporarily turn that ratcheting off, but I'll show you how this particular value, the rate under external triggering, interacts with things such as chance. It's a really cool little feature inside the vector. Anyway, I've got this patched up now. I'm going to turn the density of my triggers all the way down on Grids. I'm going to start my pattern, and nothing's happening. That's because Grids is not sending any triggers yet to the vector, but I can bring up the fill amount and start to make the patterns more busy. As I go with higher fills, I get more complex patterns. Now, blended in with the velocity variations on those different notes and that there are different samples, left and right hand strikes, this is already a more interesting pattern than just triggering the same sample or the same percussion module over and over. You'll also notice that this is kind of a 3-note pattern versus a 2-note pattern, so from measure to measure, the relationships change between them. So you get sort of this traveling pattern out of it, and you can go up to craziness on Grids. Or bring it down to something very minimal. Or turn it off completely. Now I have other patterns already programmed inside this. I've done rim shots, which are kind of like a snare hit for my particular work here, and mallet hits, which I'm kind of using for a hi-hat line. So I'm going to bring those up, show you what I've pre-programmed, but then also drive those from Grids to start creating more complex patterns where we have multiple patterns that are different from each other, driving different parts inside the vector. Let's go ahead and switch to the rim part. I've got the gate turned down on all these right now, so let's go ahead and give them some minimal gate. Now what I've done on this is I've actually programmed over and live on the computer an ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release, for the gong drum sample. So a very short trigger is going straight to a long release on this. But just for fun, I've programmed on the ADSR a short decay with that long release. So the longer I make the gate, the longer I spend letting the decay mute the note before we go into release. That's another little variation you can throw in on stuff. Go to pitch, I've got my left and right hands as before, but I've got chance operations. And we mentioned that there's different samples that can be triggered with different note values. So I might say, well, this one, go ahead and hit that alternate sample that's a fifth above. And same with this one, I have an alternate sample that's a few semitones above. So now I have some variation to the pattern. I can play velocity games as well, make them all very quiet. Or bring them up in level. Go to control, press it twice to give velocity variation. Might be a bit too much, but we always overdo stuff in demos just to show what could be done if you're a little crazy. Okay, I have alternate samples, I have velocity variation, but it's still just a very dull pattern. So this is where I'm going to have fun. Go back to globals, go up to my routing for my trigger outputs, and now set trigger 2 to be external. And I'll cue that up. Then I'll go back to the control for part 2. Say U can also be triggered externally, all for trigger 2. Let's patch that over. Trigger 2. Bring up the fill amount for that line. So the chance operations, triggering different notes for each step. And some velocity variations happening under the control setting. And I can still set overall velocity from the main velocity page. So there's my so-called snare line, and I can bring now my kick line's density back up again. I forgot one trick I wanted to show you, and that's with ratcheting. Let's go back to part 1 again here briefly. Come back to my chance operations, go to my chance probability, and bring up ratcheting. And I'll make it a higher probability so you hear it all the time. You hear it's a very fast roll now, rather than the evenly spaced ratchet it was before. This is where the rate under external triggering comes in handy. By changing this rate, I can change the speed of that ratchet. Including dotted values, etc. Let's set it to 8th. Go to chance, drop that to a low probability, so it just spices up the kick every now and then. And then the snare. And then finally I have one more line in here, my so-called hi-hat line, where I'm using the mallets, but this could again be a different module inside your modular. You could be triggering a sample inside your modular. I'm going to go back to gate. I've got 4 steps programmed for this, so we'll get some minimal triggers going on here. Starts out very boring, all being the same notes or the left and right hands of the notes. I have chance operations programmed in, so I can go ahead and do things such as trigger different samples. And do some random ratcheting. And I could still mix that straight programmed rhythm in with a grid-driven, say, kick drum. Something very funky and syncopated there. But we'd know it would be far more interesting if I went ahead and triggered this externally. Let's go ahead and drag that up to external triggers. Q. Change control for this part to be external triggers. Number 3, I'm going to go ahead and slow down the rate because I know I'm ratcheting that step. And then patch in my 3rd trigger into gate 3 over here. And then bring up its density on grids. And go a little fast on grids. or something sparse. And then bring in the other parts. Now, some of you out there are probably real musicians. I'm not. I could not program that, or it would take me a very long time to program that. But it's great to be able to use a combination of these already interesting trigger patterns, chance operations from the vector to mix it up, and then be able to basically mix the density of them. And I can use the velocity in any given part as sort of my mixer on the vector. But wait, there's more. This is going to repeat the same pattern unless I keep changing these controls or bring up the chaos control on grids. I've kind of developed a short attention span, and after I've figured something out after a couple measures, I'm done with it and I want it to change or my attention's going to go somewhere else. Well, we can use the vector to randomize what the grids is doing. And to do that, I'm going to go through a sample and hold device. I happen to be using the DivKit SSF random step because it's 6 sample and holds inside 4 HP, which is very, very convenient. Go back into the trigger outs on the vector, and you notice there's already some interesting music divisions like quarters, halves, whole notes, 1 measure, 4 holes, 4 measures, already programmed for these trigger outputs. So say I wanted the pattern on grids to change every whole note, every full pattern. I'll go ahead and take that output, which is on trigger 7 already. I need a longer cable, so I'm going to go ahead and swap out some cables here quickly. And have 7 trigger my random step. Something into the front normalizes and steps along all of the outputs simultaneously here. So that every measure, there's going to have some different output values. I could just patch these straight into grids, but they'd be at full range and they might be a little bit crazy. So whenever I have an output of something like a sample and hold, I'll typically put it through an attenuator so I can control how wide of a variety the sample and hold is going to add to my sound. So let's go ahead and quickly patch up. Maybe for the kick, let's go ahead and slim this back out, show it from step by step. I might have a basic kick like this. But then I wanted to get more active or less active. I'll take the unipolar out, positive voltages only from the random step, run that through an attenuator, and patch that into fill amount, basically the randomization on grids. Now, the way that the random step works is different than a lot of sample and holds. If you use its internal voltages, it's not evenly distributed random numbers. They tend to be near 0, and then less likely to get far away from it. So they give you little variations, the occasional big variation, then back into doing small variations. So rather than just being a completely random value, it's more like, let's stick with the theme, variation of the theme, come back, bigger variation, come back. And that's why I like the random step. I'm going to go ahead and turn up its randomization, and now on every measure, it's going to change the pattern coming out of grids. Now that might seem a little too random, so let's go ahead and just switch this to something like 2 whole notes so it happens every 2 measures. Then change. So now I have a drummer that's basically throwing in little riffs every now and then, and I can reduce just how crazy that is. I'm going to take additional outputs from random step, run it through a few more attenuators here, patch those into the fill amounts on my trigger generator, and you could even program, velocity outputs or pitch outputs from another part inside the vector to do this in a controlled way rather than in a random way. and then basically have the vector tell the drummer to add a variation in every couple of measures. So now I have a rhythmic pattern that's not random. It has a basic thing that it reverts to, but I think it's more interesting. It doesn't repeat like a loop or like a sequence or like a drum machine pattern does. And I just find these things to be just more engaging to listen to. Any questions?
Wow, that was awesome.
I take issue with one said there, Chris, is you made a little bit of a self-deprecating joke about not being a musician, but mate, yeah, I think you're doing just fine. And you've also made me really regret selling my U grids. However, I think having the big one, like you've got the proper original in this setting, if you're wanting to modulate those dials like you are, is a lot better. That's really tasty use of that source.
I have the full-size versions of all of Emily's stuff in the big case, and then I use micro versions in my gigging case just because I want to fit more modules into there. But I always try to make sure I buy Emily's original before buying a micro, just to make sure she gets some money out of the deal.
Yeah, it's a wonderful demonstration there. I've done bits of things like that, but I think you just expanded it to a whole bunch of different voices there. I love the pitch control of the sample too. I hadn't thought about using that for a MIDI target, and I was just commenting to myself I could, of course, just in my iPad do that if I wasn't necessarily wanting to drag a laptop around. So yeah, phenomenal.
Or trigger different inputs on your sample module inside your machine. You could, as I mentioned earlier. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. So with my simulator, I was just mentally working through it. I would use a channel with multiple samples assigned within zones within the channel, and then I could use the pitch CV, and I do, to select. I mean, the simple example is closed hi-hat, pitch change, open hi-hat within that voice. But your example using actual different hit sounds within a created instrument where those are assigned per MIDI note is, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't done that.
Yeah, I think it's fun to go ahead and trigger alternate notes, but not in a fixed pattern all the time. Imagine yourself, in a drum circle or whatever, and you've got some congos or bongos in front of you. Are you going to play the same hit in the same location every single time? Or are you going to throw in like a rim slap or something like that every now and then?
Yes, exactly. And I think once we sort of sit in front of our big CV-controlled machines, it's easy to kind of forget that MIDI and MIDI-controlled instruments, like you've just demonstrated, have some wild things you can do. I was just thinking if I still had my Motor ES rack, I could be doing exactly that kind of thing as well. The things I've sold that you're making me regret, Chris.
I am here to make you go bankrupt. That's what Patch and Tweak is the secret job. We kept telling people that Patch and Tweak, the idea of Patch and Tweak was to save you money so you can make informed decisions and not buy the wrong module. And it's just getting people equipment lust.
So
fantastic book, by the way, Patch and Tweak. My parents got it for Christmas for me one year. Strange that they knew to get me that, wasn't it? It's
Santa Claus must have been listening in. Yeah,
it was pretty direct, I think. And fantastic book, fantastic selection. So
we have a question. We do have a question real quick, Steve, from Medanine Music. And Chris, I think in your rack previously you were using a Bitbox. Are you using Ableton primarily because you can use the Gong simulation VST virtual instrument? And maybe that's not available on the Bitbox, that style of instrument?
The Bitbox has, it's a sampler. It's whatever you load into it. The way that I've been using it, which it might seem counterintuitive to an Ableton user, is I've been using the Bitbox and the Black Box, and there's a Bitbox right up here, just outside the camera, for loops. So I'll go ahead and load loops into the modular, synchronize them to the vector, and then live change loops over on the bitbox using its handy touchscreen. What I've been starting to use Ableton for is just get really interesting sample libraries where people have done industrial percussion, found really old things like this ritual gong drum, just unusual characterful sounds that I then want to mix in with original stuff that I patch on the modular. And that's where it's coming really handy, like terracotta pots, gong drums. Why try to sample that? Why go through the trouble of like, oh, let's sample a whole bunch of them into the bitbox and then come up with all these different triggers? You know, this is an easy way for me to get an interesting pattern out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And it's nice to have the hybrid system. I also appreciate that style of setup. And you're right, the flexibility of being able to dial something in to a bit more fine-tuned perspective. Sometimes it's just easier to use that larger interface on the computer. And, you know, for folks that don't like to use the computer, you could do, like you mentioned, and bounce the samples into the bitbox. So there's multiple ways to approach it. If you've got a sampler, you have a way to trigger it with the vector, and the creativity of how you use those is up to the user's workflow, which is what's wonderful about this.
Yeah. That's one of my tricks. And if there's not any other questions, which I'm happy to answer, I can show you another trick. We ready to move on?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
Go for it.
Let's pull this out of here just to declutter stuff because I want people to see what I'm doing. So that's creating a more interesting drummer using trigger patterns and then the vector to randomize the actual drum strikes to make the actual drum strikes more interesting. And I love the combination of chance operations with external triggers. But what I've also started using are loops. Speaking of loops from the bitbox, you know, there's one in that corner right there that we're about to use to create more interesting step patterns for even my melodic work. So let's go ahead and load up a different sequence, different demo here, and enter that one in. And let's go back to rings part here and unmute that. There we go. So I've created a real simple 4-step pattern that I'm driving rings with, another module I use quite a bit, and I'll show you some rings tricks a little bit later on. So by itself, it would sound like this. Oh, and let me unmute it over in the big mixer. And that's, you know, nice. I do a lot of repetitive sequences like this myself, but I love them chance operations. So even I might just do something as simple as hit the octave occasionally on one of the steps. There we go. And then maybe I'll ratchet or repeat like the first note. I like to put emphasis on the first note. And one of the fun things about adding a ratchet in is I have rings in 4-voice mode right now. So normally these 4 steps would be ping, pong, left, right, left, right, left, right. But by doing a double strike on one of these, it breaks up the order so that the panning coming out of rings is a little less predictable. But another thing I like to do is just go ahead and play around with the length of the sequence. I do actually have 5 pitches programmed in. I'm only using 4 of them right now. I'll use chance operations to decide whether or not to skip one of the notes or let it play, just to add some more variety in. And that's a fairly simple example here of just going an octave. I'll do all sorts of stuff like, you know, do I hit the 4th or the 5th? Do I hit the 3rd or the 2nd? Other variations in my sequences just to have some change from them from, you know, repetition to repetition. But wouldn't it be nice if that had a more interesting rhythmic pattern to it? Now I could go into the links for each step and start programming different durations to create little syncopations into it, and I've done that. I particularly like to program grace notes into the vector where one note holds for like 1 3/4 and another note has only a quarter duration before coming back around to the downbeat or something like that. But you can use the same external triggering trick for melodic sequences as well. And you could use a trigger pattern generator like grids, but what I'm going to use is I have some drum loops outside of the camera here. I wanted to zoom in so you can see what I was doing. And I'm going to take those audio drum loops of real drummers and feed them through an envelope follower to derive triggers from the drum strokes of the live drummers or live percussionists. Then I'm going to take that trigger pattern to forward my patterns inside the vector sequencer. Let's go ahead and go back to assigning my trigger inputs. And let's go ahead and use trigger 1 again and set it up to be external. Go to control and not forget to set this to external trigger. I always forget that step and want to know why it's not working. Put my ratchet down to like maybe an 1/8 note. As long as I'm here, hit it the second time, get some velocity variation. So I can go ahead and send an additional CV out to rings to make things more interesting. Okay, that's all set up. Now I have some drum patterns coming out of my bitbox. Let's go ahead and run this so I can sync the bitbox, and I'll just bring up one of those patterns so you can hear what it sounds like. Just real simple. And you might notice the LED is blinking down here on the envelope follower, following the loudest of those hits. And you have a threshold control, and we're going to be playing with that in a second, to decide which hits, how strong of a hit comes through to trigger something external. So I'm going to take the trigger output from my envelope follower, and here's a little trick I do all the time. It can be difficult to get clean triggering from external samples, particularly if they've been processed or compressed, etc. Good envelope followers allow some sort of release time, or they might have a threshold control. I've gone ahead and patched in external slew limiters like the Felice slew limiter to smooth out the CV before it gets to the gate detector. But what I personally do is I always feed these things into a module known as a trigger delay. Let's pan down so you can see that. Trigger delays not only have a delay, how long they push back a trigger in time, but they almost always have a length control, saying what is the minimum duration, or what is the duration of the trigger I'm going to put out. And you can basically use this as a holdout mask to say, well, if I set a certain duration, you see how it's behind a knob. Let's bring it down here so you can see it better. There we go. You see from how long that LED is on, that's my holdout, and it will ignore any new triggers until that light goes down because the gate length has been expired, and then we're going to trigger something else out. I'm bending a cable to the point of breaking point, so let's go ahead and give it a little bit longer of a trigger cable here. So I always patch a trigger delay with a gate length into the outputs of things like my envelope followers, just because they make it much easier for me to control what I'm doing. Particularly things get a little bit wild here. And then we'll go ahead and go into trigger 1. It's only getting some of the hits, so I'm going to lower the threshold on the envelope follower. Now if I set my threshold on my envelope follower too low, I start getting crazy repeat triggers sometimes. Of course it's going to behave, I'll show it on another one. But I can change what rhythm pattern I'm feeding into the envelope follower and the gate delay, for example, a full drum kit, to get different trigger patterns. Now what's interesting at this point is a step of the sequence is now divorced from where the trigger is in the measure. So we have these longer rotating patterns where the notes go through different phases over multiple measures as they get triggered by a pattern that may have a different number of steps than your sequence does. just to show some problems, sometimes you get some glitches like that. I tame my glitches by just increasing the length of the gate going to the vector. Almost becomes a divider. We can say only do something like maybe every couple whole notes. Or something more frantic. And you don't need to have the drums as part of this. You can take the drums out and just have an interesting sequence. And I'll go ahead and change what drum loop I'm using, and the pattern will change when it cues up here. I'll change drum loops again. We'll cue up after a measure here. You hear that glitch? Just lengthen out the minimum gate time a little bit. And bring the drums back in if I like. Change drum loops. Come up in another measure here. Take out the drums. Now pan back up to the envelope folders to see what's going on there. I'll put my gate length down to 0 and play with the threshold to decide which drums actually get through, which strikes, only the loudest ones, for example. Or more dense. It's glitching a little bit, so I'll put up a little bit minimum gate time. So this becomes another performance control, not just changing what drum loop I'm using, even jazz brushes. But I can also play with the threshold and play with the gate length just to create variations in the drum patterns. Take the drums out. Lower the threshold. And I'll go ahead and mix that in with straight sequences from the vector running on different parts. Because remember, these trigger ins are per part. All of the other parts are clocked either from their own internal timing reference or from a different trigger. So I can mix something like a real steady bass sequence, maybe something slow, with these more interesting jerky patterns on top. Now, any questions on that before I take it up one more level and show a trick?
Yeah, what envelope follower are you using in this patch? We figured out it's the A162 that you're using for the trigger delay.
Yeah, I'm using a Swastopol from Chaos Devices. That's a pretty good one. Dynamo from Bastel is another pretty good one. One of the nice things about Swastopol is that it has a filter switch on the input to get rid of some frequencies. I'll bring the drums back in and just show the differences I can make. If I let the whole drum loop come through, it can be pretty glitchy. But it does have a low-end cut switch on it that says let's filter out some of the garbage and give you a cleaner trigger.
Yeah, so like if you don't want to use the kick, or if you don't want the kick or low frequency to contribute, then it's kind of the higher syncopated bits that are creating the triggers, right?
Yes. Another trick is to put a bandpass filter between the loops and your envelope follower and tune it to which line you want to follow: hi-hats, snare, kick, etc. And
Wonderful.
if you want to go really extreme, you get something like a Frap Tools Fomana or a Verbus. Now the name of the big EQ is escaping me. That have individual trigger and voltage outputs for every single frequency band, and start to use that to drive different triggers. That's a lot of fun as well.
Ah, yeah, that's wonderful. It's like side chaining from the engineering world, but with your voltages. I love it.
Yeah, Verbus Bark Filter. That's the name I was forgetting. That or the Fomana, because they have all the outputs that are the voltages for each of the bands going through that multi-band spectral analyzer. So
Wow.
you can have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, tremendous. This is great, by the way. I don't see any updated questions in the chat line,
Okay.
so feel free to move on.
So this is the sound of rings, which we all know, and which a lot of people seem to hate. And for me, if you hate rings, it's because you've only used the internal white noise burst sound generator. What makes rings far more interesting for me, since it is a resonator, is to put different sounds through it. So we have sounds. We have our drum loops. So if I take the drum loops, and let's go ahead and pan up so you can see what I'm doing here. Hi, rings. There you are, hiding up there. And put that into the input of rings. Go up an octave. That does not sound at all like a drum loop or rings anymore. I'll put a different drum loop through it. I'll go ahead and put our jazz brush loops through it. And since it's so heavily compressed, it almost sounds like you've got a fast attack compressor coming up on this thing. And I always have a transpose module in front of my ring, so I go ahead and high notes, low notes. And of course, you can change other parameters in rings like its structure, the brightness, the damping, and really play around with the sounds. But putting drum loops through rings is a really fun thing. And actually, that was the trick to do all of the what sound like strummed guitar parts or plucked guitar parts on my set for SoundQuest Fest are actually all drum loops fed through rings. And the excerpt that Jim is going to play actually shows that particular idea in practice during the SoundQuest Fest. So that's my other trick. I called the first one, the making a drummer more interesting, and the other one's making melody more interesting. But basically by using different pattern generators, be they be something like grids or even actual drum loops or something like a bitbox, to trigger the parts in the vector to create a more interesting stepping pattern, but then combine it with the chance operations in vector, because those chance operations then are what gives variations, doubling up on notes, shifting to a different note, even muting a note. And that's what I have to share.
Yeah, tremendous. It's like how to integrate with musicians 101 right there. That's huge. I mean, if you're trying to get your modular to sync up with an external sound source or live musician, drummer, instrumentalist, I mean, that's just tremendous way to get some creative sync options. Thanks for that.
Yeah, you could certainly put a live drummer or other live musician, through the modular rather than using loops or a pattern, which also might be a really interesting thing. Or, put yourself, mic up yourself driving your modular, and then driving the melodic lines just to make things more interesting. And
Yeah,
then
huge impacts.
then your mind just starts expanding. Like, oh, I'll put a mic on the kick and a mic on the snare and put different parts in the vector, and have the other parts
love it.
still being clocked normally to go ahead and keep the melody intact in case you fell off the drum stool. But you can go ahead and drive these other parts with what you're playing.
Ah, that's just tremendous, man. So refreshing to see that. It's. I left you a comment that you have alleviated a lot of my woes.
But I mean, the bottom line for me is, besides it being a cool patching trick, is I want my modular to sound more like humans.
Sure.
And these are some of the ways I'm trying to bend it to get back the feel of when pre-COVID I got a chance to actually play in a room with multiple real live musicians who were responding to what I was doing and I'm responding to what they're doing.
Yeah, great stuff.
I think it's a really interesting way to integrate, pre-recorded loops, which if you just play them back, they can get boring very quickly. There's not much variation. There's not much timbre change, and now you have it patched through several different modules and can completely change it into some other texture. And and as you mentioned, with the chance ops on the vector, affecting rings and running the drum loop through that, now you have something that is going to change every time around, even from a static source.
Yeah, particularly since the drum loop may be at a different point than the sequence is, because I have the sequence changing the pitch on rings. So you'll hear me use that throughout over half of my set at SoundQuest Fest. But I keep changing loops, and I have the vector's velocity patched to parameters on rings, such as damping time or brightness. So every time I bring up a different loop, I also change the sound quality coming out of rings. So it sounds like, that was a strummed guitar, and now we're pizzicato violins, and now we're somewhere else. So.
Yeah, I've never even thought about doing what you just did then, but I just was chatting with another person on the forum saying, yes, I've just had to add a few things to my my parts, and modular grid's going to be moved around, and what do I need to sell? It's just, that was so creative is the point, and so unexpected. I think you've just kind of decoupled timing completely, but it's still in a really organized way, and it goes back to that theme you keep talking about, Chris, which is what is controlled and what is kind of composed, and then the things that can be allowed to run their own minds within certain parameters. I think you summarize it much better than me, but it's just a perfect execution of that concept.
I'll tell you the core of some of it, and it's actually a conversation we're starting to have on my Patreon channel, is on generative music, because I get asked quite a bit, how do you do generative patching? And one of the rules of generative patching is that it never repeats. And even Brian Eno, who's credited with making generative music more mainstream, even though he certainly wasn't the first to do it. Go check out Douglas Leedy's and Tropical Paradise on YouTube if you want your mind blown. Eno came back later in his book Visual Music and said, the problem with generative music is that it never comes back to a central theme. And people get bored because you realize that you're adrift in an ocean and you're not going to see any familiar landmarks. And that's why people don't listen to generative music for extended periods of time. It becomes background music. And Eno thought it was very important to have a generative system that went away from a theme and came back to the theme to keep people engaged in listening to it. So that's the modified philosophy of generative music I'm trying to take up in my modular patching is, let me have a core sequence, let me have a core rhythm, but let my system create variations, but they're not random. They're hopefully intelligent variations, and I can come back to the theme to keep the listener engaged.
I'm so thrilled. Yeah, no, those concepts are just tickling parts of my brain that, this is exactly kind of, it's my 12-month, you have goals for yourself musically, and a lot of the things you're talking about here is kind of really, really ear-opening. Going to have to get onto, I know I'm one of your supporters on that, so I'm going to have to get onto that chat and see what's happening there, I think.
Yeah. I think Jim actually has a let's answer any other questions, but Jim has a piece of my set from SoundQuest Fest where I use some of those techniques too, if you're curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. So there was a question, and I think the answer is yes. Do drum triggers kick enough to allow the trigger to be driven?
Oh, yeah,
and I think
definitely.
you created that using the wave inputs there, and sorry, not wave inputs, but the loop inputs rather. And I was just in my brain thinking, imagine what I could do with some loops and morphogene and the envelope follower and the trigger delay, which is crazy. Yeah, so I think Jim does have a segment, as you said. Are there any Yeah, so any more questions, guys? I think Jim also wanted to talk about the pitch representation within the dashboard at some point too.
Yeah, it's a nice trick to extend what Chris is doing in terms of modulating samples if you're working in a CV space. But we'll play a short excerpt from Chris's upcoming set for SoundQuest Fest, and then we'll come back and cover any more questions on Chris's stuff, and then open up to more general questions. So let me...
And I'll apologize in advance that the frame rate will get slow on some of this because I just am a video person for a couple decades. I cannot resist crossfades and multiple layered, and Zoom blows up when you do that.
Is that full screen for you guys before I cue this up?
Yes.
Chihuelombewa Iquicanit Villa Maok Xoconzotzona Moxochihuehue Maik Xiquimauiltia Intepilhuan Incuautin Inocelotin Huelachic Tiquitodaneuia Owaya, Owaya.
There we go. That's just a short excerpt from Chris's set for SoundQuest Fest, which is coming up. Is that already next weekend?
It's already next weekend. A week from today is my set. Serena Gabriel, myself, Ian Bodie, and then another fellow New Mexican, Michael Stearns.
Excellent. Excellent. Let me just bring that up full screen so everybody can write down the dates.
In addition to the concerts, each of us recorded bits from our studios, like studio tours and things dissecting what we play. And then Steve did interviews with each of us as well. So in addition to the concerts, there's a lot of additional content that gets you into the music.
Excellent. Really been looking forward for this for a while. It's just, again, it's kind of one of those things is we're all stuck at home, but we can still get out online and do some interesting things that would have been a lot more difficult to do, moving equipment around. And I mean, imagine trying to set up a physical festival with all those acts in one location.
Well, Steve did it 11 years ago in Tucson. He did an all-day event with like 6 or 7 acts and permutations of those acts, taking up a whole theater stage where everyone had to set up ahead of time and keep rearranging. But this is even more expensive because he has people from around the world playing in addition to other interstitials. And so it's been fun. And then also I had fun taking my set from that and sets from other things I've played in the past year, and then gone back into the studio, remixed them, overdubbed them, had my friend Richard Bug from Cosmic Debris play harmonized flute on top of them. And that's what's on the new album, We Only Came to Dream, which is going to come out next week.
Excellent, excellent. It's a great accomplishment. I know when you were building the monster system, that was the plan, was to spend a good amount of time and write some serious music, and it's so great that you've reached that the finish line.
Finish. I've just started.
All right, so do we have any more questions for Chris before we kind of open up to general items? Let's see if anything came through during the musical interlude.
Besides cutting that performance too soon, now I just have to tune in next weekend. Jeez, I was getting into the zone there, and then it was gone. So dang it. But I'm excited to see what you put out. That's going to be good stuff.
Yeah, it's a half-hour set that just flows, up, down, up higher, down. I think it's a quite a ride.
Nice,
and
very good.
It's driven, from the vector and then also arpeggios over on the Korg Z1, and it's fun to take the steady rhythm patterns of the Z1 and juxtapose that against a very slow layer from the vector, and then this intricate, non-standard rhythm pattern on top. It's really fun to mix multiple layers like that.
Yeah, way cool. Here's a question that I just kind of thought of. With this remote time that we're still kind of stuck in, have you considered or have you seen anyone demonstrate using like an audio input from someone else's system remotely into, say, an envelope follower like you were doing to kind of get an interesting sync from remote locations between two people?
That's an interesting thing. Yeah, there's a couple different jam systems, Jamulus, and I forget what the other one is, Jam Buddy or something like that. They claim to have gotten latency down to where ensembles can play together even in time.
Oh.
So it certainly opens up the ability to go ahead and take audio feeds from each other. I know what some people have been doing is taking a performance and then feeding it to a video artist in another location, having the video artist composite add stuff, and then that gets output, which is also an interesting idea.
Yeah, that does sound good. Yeah, I'll have to look up those apps because that's kind of been something that, we wish we had 12 months ago, and it's finally catching up to us in terms of the tech for what we really need.
I'm looking forward to the hybrid future. I mean, going out and playing gigs like there's, for those of us who are in New Mexico, we have a fabulous venue called Meow Wolf, which is just an amazing attraction by itself, but they have a stage. And they actually said as part of the shutdown during COVID, they expanded the stage and they're going to be having more local acts in. So one of my jobs next month is lightening up that beast, getting the power supplies out of it. Because I really want now to take this out to Meow Wolf and play live in front of people. But aside from that, I can also now be able to broadcast from my studio and things like that. It's just lots of possibilities we can do.
Sure.
You should just get a mobile, one of those big caravan things like in Breaking Bad, and just sort of drive around with your modular stuck out the back of that and just play in the middle of the desert somewhere. That would just, I'd turn.
A while back, there was a modified van that was covered with speakers. Like the entire outside of the van was covered with small speakers, and I remember seeing it in downtown one time.
Yeah, that would be just nuts. No, that was absolutely crazy stuff, Chris. It's really exciting seeing someone pushing the boundaries a bit. At least for me, that was definitely pushing the boundaries. So we did have one question. Shanda Trusty's just messaged saying, could you just quickly revise the settings within the vector that allowed you to take those inputs in?
Yeah, you have to do it in two places, which is perhaps a trick. Is you hit the global 3 times to get to the output and input assignments page. And I think Jim's about to demonstrate this. Scroll up to the triggers on the jack expander, and then they normally output pulses or triggers. But if you run it all the way to the top of the range, where it says external, it now will take in a trigger rather than sending out a trigger. That's half of the equation. The other half is then going into the control page for your given part, and then changing mode to be trigger, T1 through 8, depending which trigger you're patching into on the jack expander.
Yeah, so the first setting in globals, over to routing, down to your trigger input, trigger settings, is to set this as external. This sets this to be an input instead of an output. It actually has to flip to a slightly different set of circuitry. And that's available for any part. And now you go to the part and the sequence control page and setting the mode, T1 through T6, actually only the first 6 can be used as inputs, assigns this part to be stepped externally. And one of the interesting things in your rack is that a a lot of people are used to clocking their sequencers externally, and the vector always has some sort of internal clock running, so it can fill out the space between steps, so you can have things like pitch glide and ratchet and so forth. And so this was a way to allow you to do that sort of external stepping. The vector clock still runs internally, but the sequence part doesn't advance until it gets a trigger. And then, as Chris showed, the rate setting here is a hint to the sequencer to say how long it expects this step to be. It can be longer, it can be shorter, but in terms of calculating ratchets or pitch glides, things that happen between steps, this is the rate that it will use to calculate them. And I don't think I have, actually I can pull an LFO over, so I always get in trouble when I do ad hoc demos, but I'm going to pull in.
Don't go off the script, man. It's dangerous to go off the script.
We have to do it.
The wonders of live programming.
I have an off-screen LFO generating a square wave. We're in part 8, so I'm going to put this back where it was and jump over to part 1 and make this change here. So we dial all the way up to T1. Go back and check my global settings. This is external on trigger 1. Start the sequence.
And you have some of your steps muted, I believe.
I have my system muted, thank you.
But the sequence, you're also muting some of the individual steps. There we go.
Let's make this at least nominally more interesting. So let me adjust the camera a little bit. So I have a mini mod LFO over here, and I'm taking the square wave output, patching it into the expander, and I can change. And I still have the crucible, I believe. Let's see where, just to make sure. The crucible is coming off of trigger 3, sorry for the bump. Trigger 3, and it's still the reset on that part. So as this part speeds up, the crucible speeds up as well. And then the other sound is, I just muted, that's the surface playing a steady, more or less steady. Snare drum. And just to kind of give you more of an indication about how as I slow this down, if I change the rate, this is affecting how long the gate is held open for the note. Increase the speed of the LFO. And now I've basically in legato land. Decrease the rate. And as in Chris's example, let's turn on. So that's faster ratchets, slower ratchets, and now the second ratchet is overflowing into the new notes, so now it's a kind of a swing thing going on. So that's a really nice way to use that trick. That's actually new to me, Chris. And then one other thing I wanted to show in terms of using pitch outputs for CV control is, again, on the second page of sequence CTL, which has the velocity variation setting that Chris was using, there's a tuning setting. This is new in 2.0. And instead of getting into a talk about microtuning, we'll save that for another time. I just want to show 3 tunings that are voltage based. And when one of these is active, and we'll go with the 0 to 5 one, you go to the pitch page, you no longer have note names, you now have voltage values. And these are from the calibrated pitch outputs. So if I set step 1 to 4, this will be very, very close to 4 volts. Just, I think, a couple, I don't know, tenth of a millivolt within that range. And you can use the shift key to jump through the range, so 0 up to 5 volts. So this way, if you're working with, well, an assimilator or anything else with CV inputs, you can work in voltage values, which is often a little easier to keep your head around than trying to work with note numbers, which span several octaves and can sometimes be a little, you know, what's halfway between C3 and, you know, D5 or something. And there are 3 of these tunings. One is -3 to +7, which is the full range of the pitch output, -3 to +7 volts. One is bipolar even, so -3 to +3 volts. So that's good for, well, so a bipolar input, so you want to make it slower or faster or frequency higher or lower. And then a unipolar 0 to 5 volts. And again, all of these give you voltage values on the screen. So this is a nice handy trick if, say, you know, you've got a pitch output available on the expander, and you probably think of it like, oh, well, I'm not using pitch with this drum, but you can still use this as a CV output via the pitched parts here. And then one last trick is on the velocity output side, say for velocity 1, which I don't have patched in here, in addition to being a part output, it can also be, see on part 1, hold down shift, it can be the output of a subsequencer. And if I go to the modulation page, this is subsequencer 1. I'm going to set it to transpose, but I'm going to leave it off, and then program in some random values. Oops, wrong button. And leave that at quarter notes. And then again on the routing page, let's make this part 1 S1, and let's find another patch cable.
Now, I'm glad you're going over this, because this is something I wanted to get into now, is using those subsequences to, in essence, change the preset or change the sound on the modules I'm driving.
Yeah, it's something that's really useful that I don't use as much as I ought to. So I'm going to take the, I'm going to go for filter cutoff. That's usually pretty easy to hear, and get my regular patch cable out of, talk nicely to the patch cable and patch this directly into CV in. Of course, I still have the attenuator on the dope for VCF. Let me slide the system down a little bit and also get us back into normal pitch territory. Go back into the subsequencer, turn this all the way up, this one all the way down. Something, part 1 subsequencer 1. Don't think I have, no, that's the wrong transpose. And I think the demo gods got me on this one. I'm missing something, I can't remember what it is.
That's going to be the cliffhanger for the next episode.
I usually do this about this time, is run into something unusual.
Should we hit the gong for the gong show? Okay, your X done.
Actually, no, it's working.
Great tension build there, Jim. That was good.
And I keep pushing this button instead of the back one. Let's speed this up. And it's a little jerky because it's a direct stepped change on the velocity input.
That's funny. You're changing on a subnode, and I'm looking the other way, so I'd have that change every couple measures. I'd slow the subsequence down for my stuff.
Well, let me, so we're at 16th notes here. So leave that at 16th notes and make the length just 3 steps. And so we have normal all the way up and maybe not quite as much of a range here. I think this is also one that will respond better to a unipolar movement. So there's the slower movement you were talking about, Chris. So that's another way to reuse velocity outputs for as a modulation source. And also, of course, you get, because it's a subsequencer, you get different settings for length and rate from the main sequence.
Cool.
Okay, so that's narrowly escaped.
So, hi,
yeah.
Jim. So Warren's made the point, and it's a solid one. You could use one subsequence to control multiple parts, or patch velocity to mod input and route the mod to destinations on multiple parts without eating up a part for just doing that. So
that is absolutely the case. So
yeah,
you can route, let me switch back over.
yeah, he summarized it perfectly.
Let me get my spotlight settings back on. So instead of routing velocity into the filter, we can route it back into the mod input on the vector and jump over to the mod page and say external 1 goes to gate time. Or a little more easy to hear. Let's see, this input is bipolar, so we actually want to go back here and subsequence 1 and then bring these down. Or go to pitch or whatever over here. But the nice thing is that for each part, say I go over to part 2, I can still use this input to modulate something in part 2. It could be something different actually.
Yeah, great. Yeah, really, really good.
So yeah, it's an interesting, you know, external patching is a way to have one part influence another part. So let's see. So any more questions from the YouTube chat line?
Yeah, Travarsi just popped one in. Is there a fast way to reset your mod section back to all zeros?
Ah, okay. So let me flip back over to the system. And so one navigation trick that I use a lot for mod and control is to use encoder 9 to quickly go through the pages. And this is useful because if I'm anywhere else in the system and I want to work with external mod, I know it's the last page, so I hit modulation and I just zoom this over and I'm here. And the easiest way to shut these off if they're on is, of course, just set them to none. And then to page back, there are 5 pages in here. So subsequence 1 settings, subsequence 1 steps, subsequencer number 2 settings, and the steps for that. And then the page with the external modulation routings. There's no one setting to turn them all off at once. And And in a way, they're almost two separate subsystems. The external modulation system is pretty much independent from the subsequencers. But the easiest way to turn them off is with the enable on-off there, and then here, set these to none. So there's no one setting to do it for all of them. And then I should also mention that, say, if I have external, let's do this with, say, on the start position, external 1, and then I'm over on the control page, you can see there's a little superscript here for the start parameter, x1 being external and the first one. So the external input number 1 is modulating that. Or if I turn that off, it goes away. And then if I set a subsequencer 1 to go to, we'll say, transpose, and turn that on, then when you look in the control page, transpose will have a superscript of S1, which is for subsequencer 1. So there's a way you can tell for these parameters that there's some extra modulation going on. I don't have an indicator if you have more than one modulator on it at a time, but you can at least tell that this parameter is being modulated.
And that has saved my sanity a couple of times when I've been trying to work out why something was performing the way it does, you know, and you go, yes, that superscript is telling me that I actually did this myself and then forgot.
Yeah. Yeah. So, no, very handy. And, you know, we're always looking to kind of add those little touches to the UI that make it easier to move around and know what's going on in the system. So, let me think that kind of wraps up for the stuff I wanted to cover. Special thanks again to Chris Meyer for showing up and give us these extensive, wonderful sounding demos. And again, I'll put this up one more time for folks next week to check out SoundQuest Fest. And also, you can find Chris's music on the new Alias Zone website. Chris, what's the URL for this site?
It is aliaszone.com.
Very convenient. And also, of course, Learning Modular website.
Guess what the URL is.
Let's see, learningmodular.com, I would specify.
Excellent, yes.
Yeah.
And lots of stuff up there, videos, even like a modular synthesis glossary, which is fun. I've snuck a few Easter eggs into the glossary. I always enjoy it when people find them.
Excellent. No, it's a great resource. You know, even, you know, I always go back to the discussion on where middle C is on various oscillators. That's something that trips people up all the time, and I often kind of point people in that direction. That just in the one area where there isn't really a standard in Eurorack where middle C should live. So, you know, always something to keep an eye on. And so, okay, we're going to wind down. Thanks everybody for showing up, and stream will be up in full in I think about a half hour to an hour from now, and we will see you next month. And I'll have to check to see what the date is going to be, but it'll be the second Saturday, or is it the third? We're on third Saturdays, right? Same time, and still working out what the theme will be, but I'll post that up a week or so ahead of time. So again, thanks everybody. Cody and
thanks
Steve.
for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks Chris.
Thanks all.
It's awesome.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.
All right.
Fantastic, guys.